solve the deficit problem through appointment of an elitist commission is selling himself as a populist, and the Republican voters are buying. What does this say about pundits and all the work you do?
Well, it says that there, but for the grace of God, quite a number of us could have gone, I think. Mary McGrory made the very sobering point, since you mentioned her, that the real discovery is that the voters don't read what the pundits say. So that the only people who they probably steer wrong are the candidates who care obsessively about the press and their image. So I think there's some hope in that, at any rate, that only the aspirants for president are fool enough to believe what they read in the newspapers.
Why are we doing all this, then?
I've no idea. It beats me. I mean, if you were starting now to design a system for picking the President of the United States, it couldn't possibly look anything like it does now.
Well, the press spends too much time covering the United States, not the world. And the only story going, or the most exciting one, is the horse race, the presidential race. And it seems each year it begins earlier and earlier. And the press has to talk about something, so they keep hyping up each campaign, each primary, each caucus as it comes along. And fortunes are made and destroyed in a matter of days.
Let me show you a piece, speaking of pundits, from yesterday's Washington Post. And I've had 3 or 4 people mention it over the last 24 hours, and here is the front page of the Outlook section. Most people that are involved in politics in Washington read it on Sundays. Paul Taylor, political editor, says, Dukakis versus Bush, strike up the bland. Is that what it's going to be like if these two men are the candidates?
I think it's a bit unfair to Dukakis myself. I think it's obviously true of Bush, who's just a hole in the air, I mean, both as a person and a politician, but I think with Dukakis it may well emerge that what people want is someone who is not showbiz, sensational, but who's solid and who's honest.
Well, the article is presuming that Dukakis will be the nominee, and that's by no means guaranteed. Illinois is coming up in 2 days. Senator Paul Simon has been leading very handily. Supposedly his lead is slipping, but if it slips, Jesse Jackson will win in Illinois. And what does that say about Dukakis? I mean, Jimmy Carter lost in California, in Maryland, I believe in June of 1976 in the primaries to Jerry Brown. It was a little too late to derail him, but already indicating great weakness in Carter as a political man. Well, we see this in Dukakis now. If he can't carry Illinois, how can he logically be the front runner and the nominee?
We've talked a lot about this man, and he ends up this week on the cover of Newsweek. And one poll, the Chicago Tribune this morning, shows him leading 32-29 to Senator Simon. The Washington Post poll has a wider margin the other way. What do you think of this man, Mr. Hitchens?
Well, I'm more and more impressed. I'm much more impressed than I was last time, when he still seemed to be, you should pardon the expression, but a slightly ghettoized candidate. I mean, both in the way he thought and in the way he spoke. What's impressive this time is he's emerged really as almost as a workers' candidate, as a candidate for those who have to earn money rather than make it, who are still probably a majority in this country, and being able to make really striking impressions in unexpected parts of the country, in spite of a really wretched coverage of the early part of his campaign, where people would simply look to see how white a state was and say, well, he can't do very well there, and where the sort of bogus euphemism unelectable was used, in effect to mean black. Now, as my colleague Alex Coburn puts it, the votes are in from the old slave-owning states of Maine and Alaska and places like that, and showing very strong performance among white and blue-collar voters. I think it's the most impressive thing of the campaign, because it's the only surge that hasn't been done by image and done by consulting opinion polls. He's come from a real movement, a real feeling.
Wally?
Well, Jackson is curious. I mean, first I'm reminded of Amos Perlmutter's, the late Nathan Perlmutter's remark that suddenly people, something to the effect that Jackson is being praised now for no longer being a bigot. Well, on the face of it, we don't really know. The Jackson we have today is probably no different from the Jackson we had 4 years ago. His political tactics might be a little shrewder, but that doesn't say much. And the fact that he's doing so well, I think, testifies primarily to the weakness of the other Democratic candidates. They're just not making any impact. And Jackson, who's been running and running for years, well, there's a lot of name recognition. There's a lot of naivete. He can be very charming, charismatic, no doubt. But that doesn't say his views have really changed or evolved from '84. He's still essentially a third-world type candidate. He's in his basic values. He's represents everything I think this country stands against. He's unelectable not because he is black, but simply because he is radical. He's extremely radical. And people are naive if they don't see that.
Let me mention that you mentioned he's got off to a slow start with coverage, press coverage. And this morning's Washington Post, Jack Carmody, in his television column, talks about a survey that's been released by the Center for Media and Public Affairs of 532 election stories telecast on the 3 commercial networks. January the 1st through Super Tuesday, March 8th, show that Democratic candidate Jesse Jackson got the best by far with 74% favorable evaluation regarding his job and campaign performance, stands on issues and assessments of character, and 90% positive horse race prediction. Surprise you?
Yeah, I can only say it certainly didn't feel like that, and it certainly didn't feel like that in the early stages of the campaign. I think that it's that. I mean, as State Department people like to say, I haven't yet seen the full text of that report, but I imagine it would be for a later phase of the campaign.
Audience is looking at Newsweek Inside, the power broker. This is the cover story for the week. Wlady, what's your reaction to those statistics?
Well, again, I don't make... I mean, they disturb me in that people aren't addressing the real issues behind Jesse Jackson. Louis Farrakhan was in Washington last Friday for a lecture at the University of the District of Columbia. And his goons happened to beat up a lot of the few protesters brave enough to show up during the speeches by Farrakhan and other Marxist-type people. Jesse Jackson was singled out for praise and the jubilation in the auditorium, from what I understand, was electrifying and quite sobering. But Jackson up to now has been treated with kid gloves. Chris complains that there wasn't much coverage. Actually, there can't be a lot of coverage of Jackson. Otherwise, we'll have a situation similar to what exists in New York right now with the Brawley case. You can't confront him.
Chris Hitchens, let me ask you about the cover of Time magazine this week. Here's another man that everybody will recognize, a word that's back, a phrase that's back, the Big Mo. What do you think of George Bush?
Incredibly little. I mean, he seems to have, it seems evident even to his own supporters that he has no principles and can be filled up with whatever stance or position may seem appropriate to the latest polling figures. He's been a gross and persistent liar about his part in the Iran-Contra scandal. And I think that now that the field has narrowed to him and the absurd rather flap has died away, people will start asking what was in that memo that Rather was trying to ask about, rather than how well Bush did in avoiding the question. The question's going to keep coming up. I think the coincidence of Bush's nearing the nomination at about the time that Lawrence Walsh nears his conclusions is going to prove very exciting. And we may finally see a little justice done to the administration's perpetrators.
Lonnie?
Well, the fact that the Christopher Hitchenses of this world think incredibly little of George Bush, I think, is something Bush should be happy about. People have consistently underestimated him throughout this campaign. From the early days, he was belittled by the press, by the intelligentsia, as a man who stands for nothing, who has no principles. The only weakness I can detect so far is that Bush does not project well on television. Privately, he's the most engaging man, a very decent man, and anyone you talk to will tell you that. He's a very principled man in that he's a very civilized, decent man, which again in politics is somewhat of a rarity. And as far as Iran-Contra goes, it's very curious that people never brought up Bush's role in it until he became a major candidate.
That's absolutely untrue.
Mm-hmm.
That's absolutely untrue.
So.
If you didn't read what everyone was trying to say about him, it was only because there was a very conformist press at the time. But the idea that one has waited to make this point because he's near the nomination is completely false. I remember writing about it at the time of that memo with Amir Amnir in Jerusalem.
But again,
it incidentally shows quite definitely.
A vice president has to be loyal to his president and can't be held responsible for what is the president's responsibility. And the Lawrence Welsh Inquisition, because you can't call it a really independent investigation. It's an almost astounding thing what is happening with the special prosecutor phenomenon in this country.
Let me just show the audience that on your cover for March, the American Spectator, you have a cover story right here written by Charlotte Lowe, I believe, of the Washington Times.
Insight magazine. Yes.
Of Insight magazine, excuse me. You go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. I want to show the audience that they could read more about this.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the points Ms. Lowe makes is that Walsh has been given an incredible kind of free hand, a huge staff, an unlimited budget, one case to pursue, and he's been pursuing it for well over a year now, it seems, in a most inquisitorial way. I mean, everything is suspect, and he can almost subpoena whatever piece of paper suits his fancy. He has no time pressures other than political time pressures. He has no other cases to worry about. This is clearly exceptional in the way prosecutors work in this country. They have other cases to worry about. They have to choose and decide how to limit their resources and their time. Walsh is just given carte blanche.
Let me show the audience the front page of the Washington Post today. And lack of witnesses documents troubles Walsh's Iran inquiry. Did you have a chance to read this?
Yeah,
piece?
yeah.
What
Sure.
was your reaction to that?
Well, we know what happened to the documents, and we know they were shredded. We know they were shredded probably with the compliance, certainly with the, what shall we say, silent complicity of the Attorney General. You see, it's having an Attorney General who can't be suspicious of anybody that necessitates having a special prosecutor.
But this has become this is a political issue, not a legal issue.
I didn't interrupt you once.
Yeah, well, please.
Not to say that, not to say nothing of the fact that the Attorney General himself necessitates 2 or 3 special prosecutors for his own activities. The fact that he refuses to bring the mentality of an investigator or a cop or a Justice Department official at all to the signs of high crime and misdemeanor in high places means you've got to have special prosecutors to fill the vacancy left by an Attorney General of that type.
Would you be in favor of a special prosecutor to investigate Speaker Jim Wright?
Yes, I would, sure. Yeah.
But who would
I mean,
establish the law?
It seems to me, at any rate, from what
But as the special prosecutor law now exists, it's a creation of Congress, used exclusively to go after the executive branch. Congress is exempt from special prosecution, and so it's clearly a mechanism for settling political scores, scores which should be settled at the ballot box and not in the courts.
Yeah, but it seems to worry you more than the evidence of criminal activity in the administration worries you. I mean, which is what I suppose I would expect from the American Spectator,
funding an
which
anti-communist
believes
cause
that,
is not a criminal activity.
What, you mean nothing done in that nothing done in that cause can be criminal? Is that what you meant to say?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be that absolutist,
Well,
but it seems that what causes people most upset is not really the Iran connection, but simply the fact that money was being sent to the Contras privately.
Could I jump in here, and we'll get back to this, I'm sure, as the hour goes on, or the 90 minutes goes on, but I want to ask you about another thing that popped up over the weekend. And not just the weekend, but it seems to track through the last 48 hours. First, let's start, because we're talking about the Iran-Contra thing, with Washington Whispers right up here in this corner, and this is in U.S. News. This buds for Nixon. Before Robert Bud McFarland pleaded guilty last week in connection with the Iran-Contra affair, he visited Richard Nixon, who agreed that McFarland should strike a deal to be sentenced before he had to testify against his old colleagues. I'm going to drop this and show you the New York Times for Monday. And this is another story by Stephen Engelberg, McFarland's struggle with himself and the special prosecutor. Right down here, they have lifted a quote. Nixon describes McFarland's situation as tragic, and many people who know Mr. McFarland express sympathy for him. Mr. Nixon, for instance, said in an interview, "I've known Bud McFarland going back on 20 years. It's tragic for him and for the nation that he had to go through this ordeal." One other thing, and it's Richard Nixon related, in the New York Times yesterday, the front page here is of the New York Times Magazine, Dealing with Gorbachev by Richard Nixon, and it's an article from a forthcoming book that he's about to publish. He's about to make a speech in New York that's open to cameras. Overall general reaction to why Richard Nixon all of a sudden is being quoted everywhere.
Well, because all of a sudden he looks good by comparison, I imagine. Because this administration has managed to surpass the level of malfeasance that he attained. And also because this is a very forgiving and sentimental culture.
Okay. No, I don't think it's the question of the culture being forgiving. Rather, it's the press, which loves to destroy and then build up again in order to destroy at a later date. Nixon, of course, is quoted widely because he has something to say, and he's one of the most astute politicians of our century. He continues to follow everything very closely, and he has something to contribute. I mean, most politicians nowadays do not. He does.
I think
He's
that
filling
the
the
price